Hi, welcome everyone. So we are super excited to kick off. So we've just introduced ourselves for the folks that are here in person. If you're online, go ahead and put in your chat and your name and where you're located. We're really excited for Possip's first hybrid event. Woo woo! So thank you for being here. We just enjoyed some breakfast. If you're here in person, you would have gotten some breakfast. But otherwise, we hope that you are also energized and ready for a great conversation. So a little bit about our shared space before we get started. We invited educators and parents, and one of our goals, we do have several parents online as well. One of our goals is to represent all stakeholders in these conversations, to gain feedback from all stakeholders and to have them in these kinds of conversations as well. So many of you are both parents and educators and reporters working for Possip and many other things too. So it's so wonderful to have you represent yourself fully and wholly in this place with us. This is our first hybrid event. So we have some people here and about 60 people online, and we'll do our best to help everybody feel included. Jasmine is interacting online, so know that you've got a friend there that's chatting with you and keeping conversation going, and we're so curious to hear what you have to say. And then last, we will have time to share reflections today. So that'll come at the end of our conversation. And Jasmine will send out a feedback survey after the event too, so that we can hear what you thought. So again, welcome to our annual end of year event. You can switch the slides. We're gonna go a couple slides more. We can go one more. So we're gonna take just 30 minutes today to cover the top trends and feedback from our pulse checks that were taken by thousands and thousands of families, teachers, staff members, and also students this year. We'll share some top trends first, and then a few insights that we'd like to offer and layer on top of those trends. So first, we're gonna switch the slide and let you guys take a little look at the landscape so that you can get some context and understanding of where our data has come from. So just to give you a solid understanding of that landscape, since July of last year, over 130,000 people in 34 states and almost 1,000 schools have shared feedback through Possip Pulse Checks. That's almost twice as many schools as we worked with last year. Definitely we've added 10 or more states since last year. So it was really cool to change the slide because I got to see staff, for example, go from like a few hundred to 13,000 people we heard from. So it's really exciting to see how many more people are contributing. Out of these 1,000 schools, they're very diverse, about 60% Title I, and the feedback is shared in about 70 languages as well. So about 14% of all of our feedback comes in languages other than English. And that's really a diverse set of people sharing feedback, making a more rich and representative experience known to us. Awesome. So now we're going to start to move into some of our trends. If you want to switch the slide. Great. We'll talk about our 5 most trending topics to begin with. And before I go on, I'd like to ask the folks online to chat this in and the folks here to shout out or call out. I guess we don't have to be too aggressive with it. If you have an idea of perhaps what some of our top trends might have been. So, and reporters can cheat too. So Jasmine's watching the chat and we'd be curious to hear any guesses in the audience. No wrong answers. COVID, safety, communication. Good guesses. How about somebody from LEAD? We got you guys representing front row. Huh? Gratitude. I love that. Praise. Yes, that was good. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So in person here, people mentioned gratitude as well. Mental health online. That's great. Thank you so much for your guesses. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll do a countdown. So we're starting with trend number 5. Car line and transportation was the 5th most occurring topic. So car line and transportation were prevalent topics, likely because so many schools and districts were unaccustomed to having students back in person full time every day. And the beginning of the year, pickup and drop off is always a big topic. So we weren't surprised by that, but it was interesting to see that even in the spring, We heard parents commenting on ideas to make car lines safer and more efficient. So families asked for more staff to be present at car lines, better enforcement of rules for families, and clear speed limits. Those were just among some of the top requests around car lines. But this makes us consider a couple things. First of all, parents spend a lot of time in car line. And so we were just kind of taken aback at really realizing the full impact of that time and space spent in car line. And knowing that that car line might be a parent's daily interaction with the school and with staff, it can be seen as a very good or a very bad experience that they may take a lot of judgment or impressions from. We noticed, the reporters noticed, and our reporting manager, Amanda, said there was a lot of powerful emotive language used around car line. So, yeah, you might figure, but that might be seen as an opportunity. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So trend number 4. Boom, boom. Awesome. Curriculum feedback. This was our 4th most occurring topic. In terms of family feedback, we saw curriculum feedback around a few categories. Parents were requesting differentiated curriculum. So you would hear parents commenting on needing accelerated curriculum for some students, but then also needing to accommodate for students who were not within their grade level or were a little bit behind. So differentiated curriculum came up a lot, as well as parents wanting to better understand what schools teach. We see this as an outgrowth from virtual learning because they were so plugged into what was happening over their child's shoulder. And so a lot of parents felt a loss this year and wanted to be more acquainted with the content that their students were learning and the experience in the classroom. Parents also have thoughts, as you know, about the type of curriculum they would or wouldn't like their kids to use and have access to in school. Interestingly, staff curriculum trends also reflected needing to adapt in the same way. We talked about the differentiated curriculum. And so staff, they were calling for more room to be creative with curriculum, as well as more room to be creative with group work and adjusting pace, and asking for more of a voice in curriculum decisions at the district level. What we thought was interesting is that overall families and teachers have a lot of similarities and they're approaching the same topics just from different perspectives. So that's kind of interesting. There's a place there where everyone can get interested in the same thing. We'll move on to trend number 3. Great. So bullying and student discipline was the 3rd most occurring topic. And some interesting things around this. It's notable that this was a theme for all grade levels, elementary and above, and all stakeholder types. So families, staff, students, everyone had this as a top trend. And we saw coming back from the pandemic that just as many students struggled with how to socialize and share space as adults. So it wasn't just the kids, it was also us learning how to relate to each other and share space again. And one interesting data piece here is that the trend was more prevalent among Title I schools than non-Title I schools. All right, we'll move on to number 2. So this was a guest, I think, from Kimberly. COVID, masks, and safety measures was the 2nd most occurring topic. Some parents wanted fewer measures, some wanted more measures, which makes it really tricky for all of you and for schools and districts in general. But whether parents agreed or disagreed with the COVID protocol, communicating the protocols early and often was what they asked for. And this is also what staff asked for. And this is a perfect segue to our number 1 most trending topic. Ooh, we got some sound effects in the person, which is communication. So I think Thomas called that out, and it is probably near and dear to him as a reporter. So communication was our most prevalent comment consistently across all school levels, Title I and non-Title I. It was the most important topic to parents this year and last year. But it's a popular category and it does need subcategories. So to let you know a little bit more about what communication means, it's related to communication around content and frequency, teacher communication, and tools used to communicate. So by and large, almost all of the communication feedback is asking for more communication, which may be a surprise to some people. Parents are wanting more communication and from multiple levels. They're wanting to hear from teachers, guidance counselors, principals, and their school district. And they're wanting that to be easy. So just asking for everything. But wanting to have easier to use tools. And while streamlining the tools is helpful, what is most important to them is just simplicity, not necessarily streamlining. They don't want to have to download a bunch of different apps more than anything. And they also want to hear from their child's teacher or teachers, learning what are they studying, how are they doing, how can I feel connected to their experience.
All right, so we're going to go ahead to the insights. As you all can imagine, we have so much data that we could dig into. So one of the fun things we had to figure out is what data did we want to share back. And so I'm going to talk about some insights connected to some of the kind of bigger topics Caitlin shared. So there are key differences of feedback between Title I and non-Title I schools. So when we look at all of the categories, these are the top 5 categories in Title I schools. And these are the top 5 in non-Title I schools. Now you can see there's a lot of similarities and overlap. So you've got communication, COVID masks and safety measures. But what's interesting is here, number 3 is bullying and student safety and discipline. And one of the insights we draw from this is, in some ways, it's a little bit of a hierarchy of needs. And so you parents and families and staff are all often thinking about, and students, where do we feel safe? Do we feel safe? Do we understand what's going on? And so whereas curriculum feedback and academic support come up in the top 5 for non-Title I schools, it's almost like it doesn't get an opportunity to come up because you're still trying to make sure that your student is feeling safe. And so that's just something to think about. The other thing we've thought a lot about some of these categories where you do see overlap is the opportunity to know that you're on the same page with parents and students and staff. And a lot of times we can feel at odds with each other when more often than not, we actually are on the same page. But the takeaway here is that there are key differences and some similarities between Title I and non-Title I schools. All right, next one. This one's super interesting. And I think it speaks to the opportunity to hear from your different stakeholders. So stakeholders bring different perspectives to similar topics. So one of the things I really want to call out here, so these are trends based on the feedback from families, staff, and students. And we haven't talked as much about staff. So as you can see, number 1 for staff was teacher workload and duties. Part of why that was important this year, we know that teachers and staff had to bear a big brunt of returning to in-person learning. Caitlin was talking about the fact that we were all just adjusting and figuring out how to be together socially, which then, kind of led to student discipline. And then probably also feeling undercompensated, having spent a year out in the world, seeing how other people were living, they probably had a better sense of what was fair or not fair. But something that's also really interesting is for students, mental health support was number 4 on their list, where it didn't appear in the top 5 for anyone else. And part of why that's important is because now we're seeing nationally that the importance of mental health for students, but that was something they probably got a first eye on earlier than the rest of us did. So it just speaks to what can happen when we bring together the different perspectives of the different stakeholder groups, because everyone's seeing something slightly differently. I think it's also important to note, though, this point about the student discipline and bullying, that it came up in all 3 categories. So to me, that also speaks to the need for all of us collectively to figure out what does need to change and how can we all come together and be aligned on something that seems important because it's affecting every category and every group. All right, next one. So anonymity. So for you all who are familiar with Possip, you know that there's the opportunity for you to choose to be anonymous or not. What we found is that it's really different. So more often than not, families are willing to have their name shared, not always, but to have their name shared. Almost to the contrary on staff. Staff most often do not feel very comfortable having their name shared and feel really nervous and panicked about having their name shared. We think that speaks to a couple of things. One is just the need to over time build trust. Also being part of a smaller community, feeling like you're going to be identified more easily. And so just sometimes it's hard for school leaders or district leaders to take action. They don't know who's sharing it, but then it's also really important to create a safe space where people feel comfortable to share their feedback. Any other insights you want to share on the anonymity side? Okay, awesome. And then this is an interesting slide. There are happiness differences by demographic, most significant by stakeholders. So I'm going to talk through this a little bit. So this is the question we ask is, are you happy with your experience this week or are you happy with the school this week, depending on which stakeholder group you are. So you can see that for Title I and non-Title I schools, Title I families cite more happiness with their experience than non-Title I families. And you can see a lot of the differences actually in the mostly category. Between families, staff, and students, you see a significant difference. So whereas families say yes, and then staff 54%, and then students 23%. Where you can see the bulk of students are in this middle category of mostly, which for a lot of us probably speaks to what we would say about our educational experience, which is like, I think in retrospect, we have a lot of positive things to say about it, but on the day-to-day, sometimes it can feel a little bit like that. But having this as a starting point can give you a really good opportunity to ask yourself the question, what would it take for students to really answer yes? We know it's a high bar, but just that could be something to really think about. Similarly with staff, what would it take to, so I wouldn't say that, just more think about the opportunity. What would it take to move and make some small adjustments or movements to this? But this is really important, that this kind of difference between the different stakeholder group is the most significant. And also to share kind of more transparently between the groups, so some people can, so if families are happy, what are families happy about, and being able to share that more with staff so that they can feel better about what they're doing day to day. Because I think part of why staff often don't feel as happy is because they feel underappreciated by families often and by students. So how can we make transparent what families are feeling on the positive side so that others can feel that experience too? This space you see is between elementary, high, and middle school. It's pretty similar. The lowest happiness being in the high school experience. Part of what we see in the high school experience, sometimes people ask us, even with Possip, do high schools use Possip? Part of why they do is because when your child goes to middle school, you stop knowing who to talk to anymore. And so families really get overwhelmed with like, which teacher do I talk to? And then as high school, it gets even more complex because there's sports and there's high school, there's graduation, there's college placement. And a lot of times parents are just overwhelmed with knowing who to talk to or how to help their student navigate that new high school experience. So again, there are happiness differences by demographics, but really also thinking about your different stakeholder groups gives you an interesting way to kind of figure out how you can learn and share what the other groups are seeing with each other and have a more shared experience. All right, so just to summarize, and then we're going to leave some time for questions and discussion. So communication, again, was the most prevalent comment consistently across all school levels. And it's one of those areas that in every relationship, communication is in many ways the hardest thing to do and also the most important thing to do. Other trending topics, this is just to repeat, number 2 was COVID masks and safety measures. Number 3, bullying and student discipline. Number 4, curriculum feedback. And number 5, car line and transportation. All right. Again, while schools share similarities, there are key differences in feedback from Title I and non-Title I schools and from different stakeholder groups. Again, certain stakeholder groups like staff prefer anonymity more over others. And part of why we thought it was important to call this out is, again, this actually ends up being a big internal topic for us because a lot of times we hear back from school and district leaders that they don't always like the anonymity option, but it's important to enable to hear the feedback because some groups don't feel comfortable sharing unless they have that safety of anonymity. And then finally, family, staff, and students report very different levels of happiness and degrees of happiness. All right. So, and Caitlin's chatting from my computer. So in case you thought I was asking questions while I was here, that's why you see her in the chat. All right. We would love to just stop and take 10 minutes for questions, reflections. Yeah, would love to hear from you. And if you ask in the audience here, we'll just share it back with the group. Thomas, yeah, okay. What's the breakdown of the school Title I? So it's about 600 Title I, 400 non-Title I. Yeah. Tiffany? Oh, sorry, the question from the audience was, what's the breakdown between Title I and non-Title I schools? That was the first question. And so 60-40 is the split. All right, we've got a question in the audience here, and then in the chat, we'll love to get one, sorry. I'm like, yeah.
And then the second question, is there a way that we can see the same type of data from our school specifically on the breakdown of trends that we shared with our staff?
That's a great question. So that also reminds me to give a huge shout out to Daniel Rowe and to Christine Fisher from our data and reporting team. And so the question was, can we see these specific breakdowns from our schools and district? I think the answer is yes. Yeah. So the answer is yes. So we'll follow up to help you see that. That's a great question. And again, shout out to Daniel Rowe and Christine for bringing all this data together.
Question. Mm-hmm. Is this the first year that you've done the collection of this data?
No, so question was, is this the first year we've done the collection of this data? So Possip's been around since 2017. Last year was the first year that we aggregated all of the data that we had. So this is our second annual trends event. And it's interesting because this is our first year not of a full year of in-person learning, being able to share trends.
My question is more on is
Yeah, Caitlin, do you want to talk on that? The question is, have things shifted between the 2 years in terms of the data and insights?
Cool. So talking about some similarities from last year, I mentioned that communication was also a top trend last year. And in terms of COVID, that was also a top trend in Carline. But what is different is the amount of information shared about certain topics and the subcategories. So it's parents are often and students and staff are often circulating around similar topics, but it becomes nuanced each year. Communication, however, is always going to be something that's important, which is one of our suggestions is like, look at your PD calendar and think about what is on the calendar in terms of communications for my staff. How are my communications teams staffed and trained? Because what we know from our data this year, last year, every year, is that that is going to be a huge impact to the parent experience, as well as we talked about Carline. So I would say those are some significant similarities. And some new things are that we weren't reaching out to students last year. And this was a question that was chatted is about how many students are in our data this year. We wouldn't consider it yet a representative sample. So we want to be clear about that. I think our data had about 1,300 students or so in it, but it was under 5,000. And we wouldn't yet say that they are nationwide trends. But just like with staff, you know, it was a few hundred last year and now it's 13,000. So we're able to voice their experience with more information. And so we're excited to work with more student groups as we go forward.
Given these trends, what advice do you have for school leaders for closing out the year with their staff and parent communities?
Yeah, so Shawnee's going to take this next one. We're just going to switch our earbuds again.
Okay, cool. Do you want to call them out, Jasmine? So Jasmine's going to call out them. Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's a great question. Thanks. So there's a question. It's been difficult to read some of the comments during the pandemic. You have a request that teacher names be required. So this is a great question. This is something we've wrestled with and we'll probably continue to wrestle with. And so we've made a few suggestions sometimes to partners for whom some partners want it. They want, you know, no matter what, no matter how they share it, they want it. Some partners, I think, share the experience you have, which is it can be difficult to read really negative comments, especially if you don't know who's sharing them. Just for context on how we try to handle that, if someone shares something that's just mean and they don't share their name attached and there's no productive feedback in it, we will not share that. If we think there's something that you could learn from it we will go ahead and share that. One of the things we've suggested to people who prefer not to see anonymous comments is if you want to tell us to hide comments that are anonymous and then we can just surface up trends so you don't have to read, you know, we can be more diplomatic. That's the one option. What we found is when you close down the pipeline of being able to share anonymously, you close yourself off from being able to hear lots of stuff that you want to actually hear. And so that's the tension. So I think that we kind of think of that as a school leader decision, but that's the downside that we've seen. And we've actually heard that from both parents and staff. Staff in particular get very, very nervous. And some of that might be, so yeah, so that's kind of the feedback, but definitely follow up with us if that's something you want to talk about, is how to have it such that you can kind of like get the insight without necessarily having to see some of the mean comments if they're anonymous. Jasmine, what's the next one?
We have a question from Molly Ramos. Do you guys have top synthesized trends in terms of some of the comments that folks gave attached to their overarching answers? So communication is a struggle, and it was largely because of too many websites or apps. So I guess like, do we have trends that like get a little more specific?
Yeah, so Caitlin's pulling up some sample. They won't be able to see it though. Okay. Okay, we'll go to a different question. And then the question I saw was around recommendations for staff for how to work with families and staff closing out the year. One thing I would say is while you have families and staff that are still here, go ahead and try to schedule some focus groups or some meetings during the summer to hear from families and staff. So I know I sit on a lot of ideas because I am comfortable going to my school administration and telling them I have ideas. I get to share my opinions, but you have families who might have ideas or thoughts, or who might benefit from coming together with a group of other parents to just hear, hey, what, you know, you've seen this feedback over the course of the year. What are your thoughts and ideas for next year? What should we do? So I think that's one big thing. Two is making sure that you're sharing, especially if you're a Possip customer, but even if you're not, sharing some of the positive things that you've heard from the community over the course of the year through a newsletter, through an email, but just to really celebrate what you all have been through this year, that you came back. For many of us, the first full year of in-person learning, just really taking the time to celebrate what what happened this year, the good and the bad. I think sometimes as educators, we're all very hard on ourselves because we never think we've hit kind of like where we wanted things to hit. So I think just taking the time to really kind of, we usually start sessions showing gratitude for ourselves, but also showing gratitude for our staff. I think that would be, those would be two of my recommendations, is just creating a space. And we talked about this at the beginning of the year, it's the Possip team, the power of putting things on a calendar. So creating a space to put on the calendar, when are we going to meet with a group of parents? When are we going to meet with a group of staff? And then also taking the time to celebrate what you all have just done this past year. I'm going to share some sample comments around communication. So we talked about the high level category. Then we said it's teacher communication, communication frequency, communication content, and then communication tools. So those are the 4 subcategories. One example comment in terms of feedback for communication. The only feedback I continue, the school is great, staff, educators, administration, facilities, all good. The only feedback I continually have, and so do many other parents if you ask them, is communication is awful. There's no one safe source to go to find out what events are happening, club events, sporting events, flyer, theater, band. Unless an organization has a Twitter or Instagram page, you would not know what is going on at the school. The website and calendar is empty. There should be one safe source for communication of everything going on. Parents need to be more involved, a separate comment. Parents need to be more involved and informed of students' curriculum and informed of classes offered, maybe a weekly newsletter for the class and or school. I think it gets really complicated, especially in middle school and high school, where you have so many different teachers, you have so much going on. And so I think the reality is that the resources that need to kind of go into communications are probably higher than they are. And so that's the other thing I would recommend. A lot of schools and districts do have ESSER money, and this might be a time to invest in communications in ways that potentially hasn't happened historically. And I think that would be a new thing. But I think a lot of times the schools and organizations, we forget they're really large organizations, with thousands and thousands of stakeholders. And so what would it take to invest in that a little bit more than potentially is being invested in now? I think that's also important for enrollment and attendance. Something that's not represented in this data, but I do want to also name is, and that I know we're running out of time, but attendance is a really big priority for schools and districts. And I think probably most saw both attendance drop pretty significantly this year, as well as enrollment drop. And there are a couple of things that we see in family feedback. Families don't understand why attendance is important in the same way that schools and districts do. Schools and districts know it's important, one, because students have better achievement when they're at school and are better socialized. And also per pupil, there's also some financial incentive for attendance. Families don't know that. And so a lot of times what they hear back from schools and districts can feel very punitive or not necessarily sympathetic to what might be going on. So just as you're thinking about attendance and enrollment, just figuring out how do we communicate the why, but then also kind of follow up in ways that maybe feel more caring, because sometimes it can come across as transactional. That's just the feedback that we hear from families as well. Jasmine, anything else? Any last comments or questions? Awesome. Well, we are so thankful for our friends in person, for you all online. If you're a Possip partner or customer and you saw anything that you wanted to dig deep into, I know you all have Jasmine and Caitlin in your inbox, so feel free to reach out to them. And then we'll be excited to work together next year and come back a year from now and see. Hopefully we'll have 20,000 or more students and 100,000 staff. And so we'll have more data and insights to share from there. So thanks so much. And y'all have a good rest of the day.